prior to 2008, we had a flood ordinance, but the floods of 2008 forced us to take a hard look at what we had on the books and what we had done already and what we needed to do to react to it, because we did experience a fair amount of loss and destruction of property as a result of that. And we had an interruption of traffic, we had inundated structures, we had displaced populations and businesses, and an impact to the business community and the university and traffic flow and a lot of things. And so we had to take a look at all of those aspects, and we decided to take a comprehensive look at what was on the books and what we could do to prevent future such issues. And so we responded with ordinances and a series of capital improvement projects, flood protection, mitigation, and things like that. It was a comprehensive response to a flood.
Great.
Dave, let me elaborate just a little bit. You probably know that we had a major flood in 1993.
Right.
And people around here thought that was the biggest thing that had happened here in decades or whatever. It was a really intense event. So everybody thought we were in good shape. We thought we had good ordinances in place and all that kind of stuff. And then 2008 happened. It was much more severe than 1993. So we had to revisit that, and the council did that.
Yeah. It exceeded what we had on the books prior to that. We were at a 100-year flood event level in terms of what we assumed would be the worst case scenario and where we wanted new developments to stay out of. And in fact, the floods of 2008 exceeded that by a pretty wide margin, and we realized we needed to look at a stricter requirement, and that's what started us looking at the 500-year level.
A lot of the questions really go into greater detail than elected officials think about routinely. So I think the shorthand version is that the regulations are considerably more strict, especially with regard to what Matt referred to as the 500-year level versus the 100-year level, or the 0.2% probability rather than the 1% probability flood. So that's the major thing, and adjusting to that. And then we also have made several modifications, like we'll get into in a little bit, having to do with relocating our wastewater treatment plant, having to do with constructing a new riverfront crossings park, and trying to ensure that when floods occur, that they don't damage public health or property.
Yeah, Jim's correct, and I guess you could probably put this in two categories. One is a legislative response to the floods to guide future development, what we will allow and won't allow in certain areas that might be flood prone. But the other part is the panoply of projects we undertook on our own with other government entities and through private sector buyouts and capital projects for infrastructure and the like. And what we have now across the city is a set of infrastructure that wasn't there in 2008, but is designed to protect against the next flood and be better prepared for it and be able to withstand it.
Do you know how the thought arose? I have access to various bits of literature, like having to do with flooding in Europe. Live with the River is the gist of that material that I used to read. So I think that's essentially what we try to do, but I don't know really how that emerged here in Iowa City.
Yeah, I would say so. The University of Iowa and Iowa City off campus both occupy a sizable portion of the riverfront in Iowa City. The university, for the most part, has followed a complementary approach to interacting with the river. And I would say that their properties have done a fairly good job over the years of engaging the river as an asset. And I would say the areas off campus historically were not as sympathetic. And so you had, like in many cities, a turn your back on the river approach to development along the riverfront. Certainly after 2008, that thinking changed, and a lot of opportunities arose to rethink how we approach the river and undertake a series of flood protection measures that would also enhance the river as a natural amenity for non-flood periods of time, which of course greatly exceed flood events, so that we are better protected going forward, but in the meantime enjoy what is essentially a beautiful asset winding its way through the community.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'd say this also connects with the idea of resilience, which I'm sure you're fully aware of, Dave. But I think of two different kinds of resilience. One, the basic idea is bounce back from some disaster of some kind. But there are two different kinds. One is to bounce back to where we were before, get everything back in the same kind of place. The other is to bounce back better than before. And I think what Iowa City's tried to do is bounce back better than before.
I think the better question is which ones did not. I mean, you have the immediate period of time during and immediately after the flood where you are trying to remove people from harm's way and stabilize things as much as possible and avoid human risk. Then you have, and that involves all sorts of departments from the city attorney's office to law enforcement. And it's essentially an all-hands-on-deck situation, and you're dispatching whoever's available to interface with populations and get people out of the way and answer questions and sandbag, even if it's called for. Then you have the period right after the flood where the waters recede, but you've got a mess on your hands, and you're marshaling city resources to help with the cleanup and removal of debris and reestablishment of transit routes and things of that nature. But then you've got the long-term planning, and that's where the real work comes in, because it takes years and years after you've been hit by a flood to retool the city operation in terms of capital planning and urban planning and all sorts of things to better protect the array of city infrastructure from future flooding. And I think over all three of those categories, you're involving a huge swath of the city.
Yeah, indeed.
In terms of city departments.
American Planning Association, Association of State Floodplain Managers, Johnson County, the University of Iowa, surrounding municipalities, and a model of the Iowa River. So once I read this material, I thought the University of Iowa's Flood Center, which is also known as the Iowa, IIHR, Iowa Institute for Hydrological Research, they've been a terrific resource. And the flood model that they've prepared for the Iowa River as a whole has been very, very helpful. And I can say, I used to be a professor at the University of Iowa. So when the 2008 flood hit, I became involved in those responses. I didn't have a major role to play, but I was connected with IIHR. I was connected with facilities management at the university. My wife was an associate provost responsible for all things spatial. So when the university had to relocate, like its art campus basically, my wife honchoed that, help people decide where to go, which is a huge challenge for the university. So anyhow, all those, but IIHR comes to mind as a major resource.
I mean, we had a lot of resources. We had the university assets that Jim talks about. We had state of Iowa officials. We had some national help. We had the Corps of Engineers, which plays a major role because it controls the flood stages in the river through a reservoir upstream. All of those had to work together to come up with plans to move forward. But I would also add, because we're adjacent to other communities that are also part of the Iowa River, and in the case of Iowa City, are upstream from us, it was essential that we collaborate with them. And so you had local municipalities trying to figure out a way to comprehensively and collectively address these issues, because what one does affects the others. That was a tough one. you're offering, we had a couple of neighborhoods in particular that were residential neighborhoods that were hit quite hard by the floods. And it wasn't the first time they'd been hit. So this was becoming a repeat experience for residents in those neighborhoods. And we saw an infusion of outside dollars that were intended to be deployed toward property buyouts. So we did explore that, and we ended up doing quite a lot of property buyout of primarily residential structures. Which is, gets a mixed reaction from people. Some people were glad to get it. They were devastated and glad to get a fair price for their home. We proceeded with the buyouts and took those off the tax rolls, but at the same time we were able to create new housing elsewhere that more than offset the loss of property taxes. But as a general matter, I think doing flood buyouts in a residential zone is not an easy answer. It's not an easy process either, and I think it takes years, if not decades, to come to fruition because these are voluntary buyouts. You're trying to incentivize people to do it, and while some residents are glad to clear out, others are not. And even to this day, we have self-styled river rats who like their home along the river, are not troubled by periodic flooding, and don't want to be bought out. And you still have city infrastructure that has to serve those homes, but now you have fewer of those homes served by the same infrastructure. So I think it creates a period of limbo for a city going through this process.
I think I'd add one thing. We have two neighborhoods that were hit hard down by the river, Parkview Terrace and Idlewild. Idlewild is a condominium arrangement. So we've been able to buy out, 140 houses or something like that in Parkview Terrace. And it's been very successful, no real property tax hit to the city or anything like that. Idlewild, because it's a condominium association, needed what, unanimous agreement?
100%.
From all of its condo owners. And they couldn't get that, so we couldn't buy out Idlewild. And that created a very complicated, difficult situation for us to deal with and for them to live with.
It was clear to us after the 2008 flood that we needed to have better controls over where future development can occur. And we've talked about how we shifted from a 100-year to a 500-year approach to development. And that's the route we took, with certain exceptions, but we did go that direction, in that direction. I would say that the reaction from the community was pretty positive. We followed a very transparent process where our deliberations were open and we explained why we were thinking we needed to do these things. And there really wasn't much opposition to the direction we went in. Now, I will also say that Iowa City's the impact of the 2008 flood to Iowa City was fairly limited in that we had two neighborhoods that were hit pretty hard. We had some commercial impact, but not a lot of commercial impact. And a lot of I would say the bulk of the rest of the impact was to University of Iowa facilities by far. And so we didn't have to worry about them. They were handling things on their own campus. But the legislative and other changes we undertook didn't impact all that many businesses, actually. And I think maybe that explains some of the mild reaction to what we were doing. And the rest of it was essentially public infrastructure, raising bridges and roads and fortifying our sewer and water systems and things like that were essentially no-brainers.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that, as Jim mentioned, we had a flood in 1993. We had another flood in 2008. And over the 5, 6, 7 years that followed, we had several more flood events, not to the magnitude of 2008, but enough that we had overtopped roads and our primary arterial ingress and egress out of the city was blocked for weeks at a time. And became this 100-year or 500-year nomenclature became somewhat meaningless, because those conceptualize a once in 500 year or once in 100 year occurrence. Well, we were seeing that, every couple of years, and so we just knew that we needed to get to a higher level of building, and so we did the best we could, but also being mindful of aesthetic concerns and cost and things like that.
So this is a project that actually Matt and I were both involved in, because I came onto the council at the start of 2012, and we realized that we wanted to elevate Dubuque Street, which, what Matt said, is a major highway leading into Iowa City. It's probably the most scenic road leading into our city. There's also a bridge, the Park Road Bridge, that had inhibited the flow of floodwater. Stuff got logs got backed up there at the bridge, so we needed to do something about that. But because it's the most scenic entryway to the city, and because there's a steep wooded hillside on the east side of Dubuque Street with some buildings up there and homeowners and all that, we had to figure out some way to design this project so that we didn't undermine the scenic character of the entryway, so that we could facilitate the flow of traffic, whether there was in the event of a high flood, so that we could elevate the bridge high enough so that there would be no obstruction in the case of a flood, and so that the bridge could enhance the New Hampshire auditorium that the university was in the process of building, a very expensive building, and so that we could provide space for bikeways and better pedestrian trails and better intersections and pedestrian crossings and all that kind of thing. So we had a lot of staff input on that, and we processed that quite a bit over a lengthy period of time, and had difficult conversations on our council about how high to elevate the road, how high to elevate the bridge. Did we want just an ordinary concrete bridge, or did we want one that was aesthetically more compatible with Hampshire? That kind of thing, and there were costs associated with each of those decisions. So eventually we came to decisions on those things, and I can say that the project is now 99% finished. There's just a little bit of landscaping left to do. We'll have a grand opening in the spring. We had a major flood, another major flood actually, at the end of September, early October of this past year. And we were very concerned about that. It looked like it could be a problem. It proved not to be. We had no damage and no flooding of that roadway or the bridge at all. So the Gateway project worked exactly as it was designed to.
Could you touch on the funding, how that project was funded?
Sure. There's most of it, well, half, I guess, came from a local option sales tax that the state authorized us to use. Was it almost 25 million came from the state, or it came through the local option sales tax. The total project, this says 41 million basically. I thought it was more than that, but
it was 40-something million.
Yeah, and then other bits of money came from the U.S. Economic Development Administration, from the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Committee. I don't know if that's federal or state. I guess it's federal. Iowa DOT, Surface Transportation Program funds, sanitary sewer, trunk sewer, capital investment project having to do with sanitary trunk sewers. That was another thing we were able to do, is because we knew we need to rebuild Dubuque Street. That gave us an opportunity to install a brand spanking new sewer trunk line underneath the roadway.
Yeah, Jim painted an accurate picture of that particular aspect of our flood response. But this new entryway, the elevated Dubuque Street entryway, it was just about the biggest piece of our response to the flood and our capital planning. It was one of the biggest projects we've ever undertaken as a city. But it was an obvious one, because every time there was a flood, that road would be one of the first things to overtop with water, and it would impede commuter traffic, it would impede the university. There was a major dormitory right along that route. It would impede the hospital and in the university employment sectors and emergency workers, and it just had to be dealt with. One of the nice things about a flood, if you can say that, is that it unleashes, and pardon my pun, a flood of resources to bring to bear. And in the case of Iowa City, we had a lot of capital projects that we wanted to tackle. Aging infrastructure, aging bridges, roads that needed to be redone, aging sewer and water trunks, and elsewhere in the city, an aging wastewater treatment facility. The monies that came into Iowa City and the University of Iowa, while I'm at it, permitted a massive rebuilding, and it was a great opportunity for us to shore up some of our infrastructure and replace what needed to be replaced. And Dubuque Street was a good example of that. It was necessary. It was an expensive project, and also one that we had local tax dollars in through the local options. There's a sales tax that was dedicated completely to that effort, and it helped us leverage state and federal dollars as well. So we asked our own community to put its money into the game, and it chose to do so. We had lots and lots of public meetings. We had presentations. We had very good planners and outside consultants who came to the council and to the public with schematics showing what was envisioned. And for much of the public, the minutia of numbers and feet above flood levels and percentages of risk and those things are noise. What they want to see is what it will look like. And that's typical in local government. People want to see a photo or a picture or a rendition. And we worked with that. And we dealt with homeowners up and down the stretch who had varying degrees of happiness about what we were planning to do, and there was some pushback. And some of the plans were adjusted in response to the concerns we heard. But I think there was a general sense among the community that this was simply required, and we had to do something, and we had to do it properly. And because of the scale and expense, it had to be done right.
I think that's right. The big picture, I don't think there was big disagreement over that at all in terms of the need to respond and generally what to do. There was disagreement about particular details, and we processed those, made decisions, and now it's done. Part of what we can point to is the Riverfront Crossings Park development. So there were really three major components of our flood recovery effort, and we've already touched on two of them. One was the buyouts and so on, having to do with those two neighborhoods located near the river. A second had to do with the Gateway project and elevating Dubuque Street and building that new bridge. The third had to do with moving our north wastewater treatment plant, tearing it down, moving all that sewage treatment capacity farther south to our south wastewater treatment plant. So that involved demolition and then building new capacity farther south. Once we tore the north wastewater treatment plant down, then we had an opportunity to do something with the vacant land. We got a lot of help from EPA in terms of preparing possible plans for what to do there, EPA being the Environmental Protection Administration. And eventually we came up with plans for Riverfront Crossings Park, which would be part of what we call the Riverfront Crossings District, which is really the area south from downtown with the river on the west side, Gilbert Street on the right, and Highway 6 on the south. That whole area of Riverfront Crossings District was an area we thought could be redeveloped in a significant way. This aesthetic focal point of which would be this new Riverfront Crossings Park. So the park now, we've done 3 phases of the development of that park. We're going to have a grand opening for it sometime late in the spring or early in the summer. And then there's at least one more phase to come after that. It involves bike trails. It involves using the land that the wastewater treatment plant used to be located on as a place for floodwater retention, so that when Ralston Creek overfloods its banks, some of that water can be retained in the wetland that we created down there, and in an oxbow that we built that's part of that wetland. But when it's drier, people can use it for all sorts of just standard park purposes. So there's some really lovely new child-oriented playground facilities, a lot of bike trails down there, a little bridge that goes across the river and connects to, what's the name of the very popular beer spot down there?
Oh, Big Grove.
Thank you, Big Grove Brewery, which is a really popular place. So, yeah, that whole ensemble, Riverfront Crossings District with Riverfront Crossings Park located within it, together have really expanded the ability of the city to attract investment, and a lot of investment has gone into that area already.
Yeah, and we created in an area that we knew would flood, and where we needed to have capacity for excess waters coming through a tributary creek, an outdoor space with a beautiful view that could also serve as a flood mitigation area. And we created the Iowa city equivalent of an oceanfront view for the private property that sat behind that. And what we're seeing up and down that stretch on the private side, the privately owned side of it, in from the river, is substantial and ongoing reinvestment in residential, office, commercial. They've got a great view now and an amenity right along the river that also doubles as a flood mitigation zone. I would also say, more generally speaking, that when you bring infrastructure and streets up out of harm's way in terms of flood events, you maintain the flow of traffic, you maintain the commercial viability of areas that need to be accessed from other places. And so you keep those businesses running, you keep the university running, and you're not shutting down. Also, as you protect your infrastructure as a municipality, whether it's protecting wellheads or storm sewers or electrical substations, you name it, the more you can do to protect, the less you have to do during and after a flood to shift them, relocate them, whatever. And the fewer emergency responder resources you have to deploy. So it's not just an economic impact on the private side, it's also just a matter of saving time and money and precious resources for the local government.
Well, I'm going to draw upon this text I got from our staff, because this is the kind of thing I don't think about day in and day out. So we advertise on our website. We send out an annual flood awareness bulletins with water bills. We send out an annual letter to a repetitive loss property that we have in Iowa City and to adjacent properties. There's a link to FEMA's website on our website under floodplain information, and so on. I mean, there's those kinds of things. Yeah. But I don't think about that day in and day out. We have a council manager form of government, so I presume that our city manager is doing this kind of thing and ensuring that his staff is doing this kind of thing.
And I would say that, in 2008, certainly we had the internet and things like that, and Facebook was nascent, but it is a different era now, and so connectivity between local government and the community is broader and different. But no matter how developed the city's connectivity through social media or otherwise is with the community, I don't think we'll ever get to a place where individual, door by door knocking, especially in the event of like an evacuation, is going to have to happen. And you have people of varying degrees of connectivity or engagement with the city, and some people, despite all of your efforts to put information out through water bills or over social media, just won't know, and you have to reach them personally.
Yeah, absolutely.
it's an all-hands-on-deck situation. We're sitting in the council chambers right now, and this was the site of the war room, if you will, which was an incredible array of local officials from law enforcement to public works to the city legal department and everybody in between, with conference calls and Corps of Engineers people and people from state and national outfits and congressional, the political side, people who might be able to help free up money. I mean, that's an intense experience. And I remember in the middle of the 2008 flood, one of the things I was instructed to do was to make contact with a mobile home court that had a largely Hispanic population, and I speak fluent Spanish, and they dispatched me to go speak to those residents to help evacuate them and use my language skills to do that. And I remember running red lights with my blinkers on, and there's an urgency to it, because even though floods move slowly, you're also racing against time. But primarily, it's a staff-driven response, and those plans are maintained and developed by staff, and as an elected official you need to support their work.
I think Matt's exactly right about all that. I would add a few things, though. One has to do with anticipating what might happen in the future. I think we should all anticipate that future flooding events will be worse than whatever we've experienced up to now.
Yeah.
And how many of those, I don't know, but just looking ahead, I think that's likely, very likely to be the case. We need to be prepared to be resilient in the way I just described, bounce back better than before. And I'll mention one other thing that has to do with response. We had a surprise big flood at the start of October this past year. It really looked like it was going to be a really severe thing. So I sat in on one of these conference call kinds of things that Matt was alluding to, that involved the National Weather Service, the Corps of Engineers, the county, the IIHR over at the University of Iowa, and I don't know, a few other people. And I was really impressed with the extent of coordination. So we knew what the inflow to the Coralville Reservoir was. We knew what the outflow was. We knew what the river levels were. We knew what the forecasted river levels were, et cetera. We knew all those kinds of things. So we were able to, in real time, have a pretty good idea about whether we were going to have to do something really special or not. And it turns out we did not, because we had elevated Dubuque Street and we had put a new bridge in, and things turned out okay.
And let me add one thing to what Jim indicated. That I think a noteworthy change in the dialogue that you saw after our 2008 flood was that we went from, both as elected officials and staff members and outside consultants, talking about if we see this again, if there is a flood, to talking about when there is a flood. And to Jim's point, and given climate change and what we know is in our future, the planning any city or local government does should be, I think, done with the assumption that there will be events, that you are not immune from this. And in the case of Iowa City, I think that helped us make the case to the people we serve that we can do it now or we can do it later, but we're going to have to do it eventually.
Yeah. You don't know how severe the events will be. You don't know when they're going to come, but they will come.
Yeah. In the immediacy of a flood, you have to rely on staff. And you as an elected official, you are there to authorize action if they need emergency funding or they need some sort of ordinance change to permit emergency actions to be taken by law enforcement or whatever. You're there to support and do what they need, but by and large, you stay out of the way, because this is your staff has contingency plans and your fire department knows what to do, and so on and so forth. But longer term, that's when the elected officials are more necessary, because now you're part of a planning process and a funding process to do these massive projects, whether it's a buyout or a change in infrastructure. Plan ahead. Well-run operations will know where the probable flood areas are, and And if you have proper, advice, you'll know how much rain and how much, a given water level will flood a given area. And so you know these things, and you can create a list of higher priority areas that you'd like to see some changes to, whether it's a bridge that needs to be replaced or a piece of infrastructure somewhere else. Iowa City was blessed in that the damage to our people and our businesses was relatively limited. Cedar Rapids, Iowa, up the road, was hit far worse than we were. I would say 100-fold worse than we were. I mean, it was just a night and day difference. And so I was grateful for the limited impact that we felt here. But that limited impact then just unleashed an incredible amount of outside resources, both to us and to the university, our partners here in the community. And the two institutions, as well as other local governments, made the most of it. So make the most of a flood, because it typically will result in a lot of opportunity.